Hello everyone and welcome to Men of the Infinite series God Debunked, in which we'll not so much be debunking God per se as casting a critical eye over some of the classical arguments for his existence. Arguments that despite over 2,000 years of Western philosophy remain persuasive, if not compelling, to a great many people. And that fact alone makes them worthy of attention. So, first cab off the theology rank is the cosmological argument, better known as the first cause argument. Now, this is actually my favourite argument for the existence of God, not because it contains any validity, it simply does not, but because it presents us with issues that are of quintessential importance to anyone interested in gaining an understanding of the nature of reality, self, consciousness, and so forth. And I'm speaking here of the issues of causality and infinitude, or the infinite. Okay, so let me just get rid of our oddly homoerotic pink night-shirted God and pop a generic version of this argument on the screen, and we'll see what we can make of it. Now, this argument basically runs like this. Its first premise is every finite and contingent being has a cause. That could be expressed more simply as all things are caused. Its second premise is nothing finite and contingent can cause itself, or things just don't cause themselves. Its third premise is a causal chain cannot be of infinite length, all of which leads to the conclusion that therefore a first cause must exist. Now, I'm going to get rid of premise 2 because it isn't really necessary for this analysis. I think we can keep things a little simpler than that. So at first glance, this argument seems intuitively powerful to many people. If there can't be an infinite series of temporal causes, then there surely must be an original cause. But for those whose intuition has a somewhat more logical character, the argument gives an impression that sort of grabs you by the crotch and squeezes till you're forced to scream an objection in the hope of gaining relief. To such people, it's immediately obvious that not only does the conclusion not follow from the first premise, but it flat out contradicts it. If the first premise is true, then this first cause must itself have a cause. In this respect, the argument fails the very first test of logical rigour. It is formally invalid. But, despite outward appearances, theologians are not entirely silly, and they responded to such a rebuttal. I mean, they knew they had to do something with the object of this conclusion, or be accused of engaging in special pleading, wherein the first cause had unique and magical properties for no particular reason. So to get around this obvious flaw in the argument, they cleverly assigned to this first cause the attribute of eternality. They said that it is eternal, hence the commonly known phrase, the first cause itself uncaused, because an eternal thing cannot have an originating cause by definition. Now, once again, this seemed at an intuitive level to be a solid workaround. If the first cause can't be caused, it follows that it must be eternal. This made a great many people very happy. But does this workaround really solve anything? I guess it does if you ignore the question of the nature of this eternal first cause, but not if you bother to ask a couple of simple questions about that nature. Namely, is the nature of this thing or being or whatever dynamic or static? It surely has to be one of those two. If its nature is dynamic, if it has its own internal processes, such as we find in all conventional notions of a theistic God, then it cannot be what the argument requires it to be, because it falls foul of the point contained in premise 2. An infinite chain of causes and effects or processes means it cannot ever reach the point of being the first cause of the world. But what if its fundamental nature is that of stasis? That is, it has no internal dynamics or processes, it essentially does nothing, like a sort of grand cosmic doll bludger. Well, this option fails as well, because a thing or being whose fundamental nature is that of stasis cannot be or begin to be the cause of anything at all. For it to do so would contradict its own nature. So the two options we have for the nature of this first cause, itself uncaused, fail to meet the needs of the argument. Therefore, even with this workaround, the argument continues to fail. By dint of the very premises of the argument, the conclusion simply cannot work. And given all this, modern theologians, with a little bit of unwitting help from, of all things, modern cosmology, or I should say self-serving interpretations of cosmology, have come up with a contemporary form of this argument known as the cosmological argument, which is really just a linguistic or semantic variation, and it runs like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, if universe in this argument is being defined as the physical phenomena and properties thereof that we experience on a daily basis, as opposed to reality in an ultimate sense, or ultimate reality, or the totality of all that is, I don't have any kind of problem whatsoever with this argument. It's perfectly sound. But really, when you distill that argument down, it's really only saying every finite or contingent thing has a cause. I mean, there's nothing new in that argument. It's not like no one in the history of humanity has ever actually conceived of that point. But the question that comes leaping out at you from this variation of the cosmological argument is, what the hell has this got to do with God? It could be an argument for anything. You cannot get to God from this argument. Or at least you can get to anything you damn well please from this argument. It's not an argument for anything in particular. This could just as readily be an argument for quantum fluctuations arising in a second dimension of time. You cannot logically get from that syllogism to any particular thing. You certainly cannot get to the conventional theistic God. Whilst this argument may have some basic philosophic merit, if you try and place it within a theological context, it becomes completely meaningless. It's in fact quite laughable. Indeed, I don't think this version of the argument has the same power as an argument as the original version. So in my view, we can summarily dismiss this modern take on a very old argument. Now in part 2 of this first installment of the series God Debunked, I'm going to look at this argument from a more Eastern or Zenish perspective, and I'm going to pose the question, does the very basis of this argument, the heart and soul of this argument, that is, the idea of a temporal chain of cause and effect, itself have any fundamental merit? Does this temporal chain of cause and effect actually exist? Is it really out there in the world and a true intrinsic part of reality itself, or is it simply an artifact of consciousness? Thanks for being with us here at Men of the Infinite, and I hope you can be with us again for the second part of this installment of God Debunked, the cosmological argument. Till then, take care and remember that truth is valuable.